What is an arena fighter? On the surface, it's just taking fighting game and sometimes action game elements to facilitate battles with characters that have full three-dimensional movement in an arena. But over the years, the arena fighter has evolved in various interesting ways, and there isn't a resource detailing where they came from or how they changed over the years. At least, not one that I can find. I'm a big fan of arena fighters, so I wanted to make a video detailing the genre throughout its history without bogging down the length describing every arena fighter and what it tried to accomplish. It's important to note that arena fighter history doesn't go in a straight line like most genres do, so we'll have to overlook some titles and just talk about the most influential ones. And to do that, we have to go back to the beginning, before arena fighters even existed. The story of arena fighters starts back in the arcades. In 1993, Namco would release a new arcade machine by the name of Cyber Sled, a fast-paced 3D game where you played as a tank and fought against another player or CPU in an arena. It was unique in that it featured one-on-one battles, a fully explorable 3D arena, and range-focused combat where you can hide from shots behind objects. It even had lock-on missiles. Though Cyber Sled did not play like how you'd imagine. It used twin sticks to move its vehicles in what you might know as tank controls.
If you push both back, you move backwards. If you push both to the left, you move to the left. If you push both to the right, you move to the right. If you push one forward and one backwards, you spin.
This combination would prove to be very popular. Game Machine listed Cyber Sled as being the second most popular arcade game in Japan during October of 1993. It would even be successful enough to warrant a sequel, Cyber Commando.
It was a unique enough concept that other developers were inspired to innovate on the formula. Not long after Cyber Sled was Reverthion.
It featured nearly identical gameplay to Cyber Sled, one-on-one fighting in an arena, tank controls, and locked-on range combat where you can hide behind objects. But there were a few differences. First off, instead of tanks, you fought in insect-shaped mechs. It was also much slower than Cyber Sled, but it tried to make up for this by having jumping, dodging, and arguably the first implementation of the boost gate, where you can use a resource to boost your mech around the stage and even slam into the opponent. It also featured ring outs and fighting game-like special abilities that you had to do inputs for, like shields and grapples. Reverthion was trying to do some new things and was mildly successful, but it ultimately did not mesh well with a lot of players, citing it as a slow, clunky version of Cyber Sled. But the same can't be said for the next game to take the stage. Not even a few weeks after Reverthion's launch, the Japan Amusement Manufacturers Association show, or JAMA, was in full swing. This was where a lot of companies would show off their new arcade machines. While having been previewed in EGM before, it's here that Sega was showcasing Virtual On, a new title where mechs using an assortment of melee and range weapons fought each other in an arena. What set Virtual On apart from its contemporaries was that it used humanoid mechs instead of tanks. So now we could do things like swing a sword or hold a gun. And this opened a lot of room for weaponry and character archetypes. On top of this, Virtual On also featured dashing, the ability to rapidly move your mech in any direction to dodge or set up shots. This added mobility would have made fighting difficult, but thanks to the jump button allowing you to relock onto your opponent, and that almost every attack was lock-on or AoE, Virtual On was surprisingly fluid. That is, if you were using the twin sticks it was designed for. That's right, we haven't got away from Cyber Sled's influence just yet. In fact, in Next Generation issue number 12, the writer talking about JAMA mentions that the game owes a lot to Namco's Cyber Sled, but ultimately surpasses it. This gameplay, enhanced by the great mech designs of Hajime Kotoki, would lead to Virtual On being the most successful arcade game of the year. And the series would build on itself by adding much more to its repertoire in its sequels, including directional melee attacks that could be used at close range, simple combos, and blocking, among other features. Virtual On gameplay influenced many titles after it, including Reverthion's sequel, which would feature humanoid mechs instead of insects, and Real Robot's Final Attack.
Real Robots Final Attack.
This is the actual name apparently, which would feature mechs from the Gundam series. This is where arena fighters started to congeal. There were still games being made in the likeness of Cyber Sled, like 1996's Hyper Tyson or even RoboPit, but Virtual On was the new standard for this genre, even for primarily PvE games. But the most important series that Virtual On would influence would be Mobile Suit Gundam. Starting with Mobile Suit Gundam Federation vs. Zeon, the influence is apparent. Lock-on projectile combat, check. Directional melee attacks, check. But there was something missing. Tank controls, replaced with normal analog movement, for the better mostly. The tank controls for Cyber Sled and Virtual On were designed specifically for the twin sticks, and a lot of people took issue with the controls, especially on home consoles. One reviewer saying that it was a must avoid if you did not own a twin stick. Thankfully for him, Gundam's gameplay being modernized made it more accessible and enjoyable to a wider range of players. But simpler controls were not the only thing Gundam was bringing to the genre. 2-on-2 gameplay and the beginning of its own original boost gig would be mainstays, but there was also the cost system. In Gundam Versus, the player has a resource gauge that depletes when you die in battle. The more powerful the unit, the more it costs to replace after you die. These three features would grow and evolve with the Gundam Versus gameplay through several titles, really advancing the ideas it started with. There were some devs trying to make their own unique spin on the genre, such as One Must Die Battlegrounds, which had you controlling each limb individually to fight, or Heavy Metal Geomatrix, which focused on items you could pick up, but most were building on the foundation these mecha games put down. A great example being Gotcha Force, which 2 decades later still has some of the most inventive character design in the arena fighter space. Also Astraea, but nobody played this game. Now, before we get into more, this is actually only one half of the story. Just like fighting games had their 3D counterparts, there was another style of arena fighter that came out shortly after the release of Virtual On and would set the stage for a new experience. It started with Bushido Blade. Developed by Lightweight and released in 1997, the main difference between this game and the first Arena Fighters is the camera. Instead of the camera being behind each player, the camera provides a view of both players from outside of the arena, and zooms and pulls back to adjust for the distance. This allowed a consistent viewpoint similar to traditional fighting games, which comes with the added benefit of better local play, not needing 2 monitors or more likely 2 arcade machines to have matches. Bushido Blade would not feature the traditional life bars, instead having a body damage system, where most direct hits that land kill the opponent, but hits to the arms or legs will disable that body part. It also introduced verticality, allowing you to climb objects to get to higher ground. It was a really interesting concept and would lay the groundwork for a lot of games to build upon in the future. One of those games being Air Guys. Developed by Dream Factory, it would come out just 1 year later and feature smaller arenas with the addition of health bars. Air Guys took a lot from Tobal No. 1 in wrestling games to form its identity, but was mostly popular due to its inclusion of FF7 characters, and also infamous for these jarring menu sounds. Shortly after Air Guys, we would have games like Karyotose, which would remove life bars again in favor of throwing opponents off the stage, and Destrega, which added more complex ranged abilities. Each button corresponded to either a melee attack at close range or a chargeable magic attack from far away. Each character had unique magic and could combine them in multiple different ways to make unique combinations. This would add character complexity and much needed diversity in the arena fighter space. But all of these would pale in comparison to what would arguably be the most defining arena fighter of the era.
Welcome to Power Stone War!
One of the aspects that was lacking in early arena fighters was the designs. Blind Knight with a sword isn't exactly the most interesting thing to look at, but Capcom were masters at fighting game character design, creating some of the most memorable video game characters ever. And their colorful and expressive game design was infused directly into Power Stone, where once we had drab, dark environments, we now have colorful backdrops. Simplistic attack animations turned into fire-infused uppercuts and giant spirit bombs. Characters flew across the screen after getting hit, people were throwing chairs and shooting rocket launchers, and this guy turns into the Thing. I mean, what is even happening here? Power Stone was chaotic and fun and expressive, and its sequel would popularize set-piece stages dynamically changing over time. It cemented itself into the minds of pretty much everyone that played it and had a large part in the arena fighter boom of the early 2000s. After the success of games like Power Stone and early Gundam Versus, people were really starting to get into the genre and the ideas were spreading. Everyone in their parent company were trying to make an arena fighter in the early 2000s, especially since they were cheap, fun games to make on existing IPs. From the kaiju-style Godzilla and the War of the Monsters to manga and anime properties like Bleach, Inuyasha, and One Piece, to comic books like Rise of the Imperfects, to Western properties like Tom and Jerry, Billy and Mandy, and Shrek? Yeah, it got pretty wild. Unlike most fighting games, some of these were made on accident with developers just trying to make fun multiplayer games, and some just had PvP as an afterthought.
You can see this in a lot of 6th generation titles, where developers seemingly were just trying to have some fun.
There were actually quite a few action-adventure games that had an arena fighter-style versus mode for local play. Games like Shaolin Monks and Star Wars Episode 3 had fun modes like this, and we obviously can't forget the amazing Kung Fu Panda versus mode. Even with smash hits like the first Ninja Storm and the Budokai Tenkaichi series, competitive arena fighters weren't a big thing, and most companies did not make them to be that way in the first place. Usually specifically making them party games with items and stage hazards and whatnot. 2000's arena fighters were really defined by their accessibility and fun factor, not their competitive viability. This would change with the release of Gundam Extreme Versus. Gundam Versus had already been influencing the market for years, like Cosmic Break taking its cost system and a variety of mech games like Boot Fighter Window XP and Silver Knights being inspired by its mechanics. But Gundam Extreme Versus would seal the deal and become the definitive competitive arena fighter. With frequent balance patches, replays, and a PlayStation port with ranked, Gundam Versus became one of the most popular arcade games and ushered in an era of competitive arena fighters. Despite the difficulty in getting local play going, still needing 4 monitors or arcade machines to have matches, you can still find side tournaments at EVO or many major fighting game tournaments. Its success solidified the mecha arena fighter formula and courted steel, with almost every modern mecha arena fighter taking the majority of its mechanics. Even non-mecha titles like Dissidia NT or the now defunct Rise of Incarnates were trying to put their own spin on some of the fundamentals, but nothing would outshine Gundam with its ever-increasing cast and abilities. Meanwhile, arena fighters based on anime IPs were still around but with a new look. The sequels to Ninja Storm leading the charge with Storm 2's new online functionality. Storm featured a camera that almost combined the two arena fighter styles, not giving you a pulled out view of the stage but not being third person either, instead focusing on the characters in the foreground. It had some of the staples like directional melee attacks but went all in on the visuals and tried to make its own interesting system using a defensive resource gauge. Storm would accrue a massive fan following, and its dedicated players pushed for competitive play even to this day with some mild success. But in its wake were an absolute plethora of anime arena fighters trying to capitalize on its success. Unfortunately, a lot of these were not made to be competitive and often failed due to their lack of interesting or balanced mechanics, similar to how it was in the PS2 era.
This was important because this era was the start of esports becoming a huge part of the gaming landscape, and arena fighters were being more harshly criticized for their gameplay than ever before, leading to the more casual arena fighters to die off. Kaiju-style games had largely disappeared, and most games with Power Stone style of gameplay were regulated to Steam indie titles, which were often fun but never usually gained much traction. It was around this time that arena fighters began to expand in new ways that some think even disqualify them from being arena fighters and put them in their own category. These new arena fighters would take the fundamentals and expand upon them, leaving the arena itself to fight in larger stages with objectives or even roles. And the first of these was designed by a well-beloved fighting game developer. Guilty Gear 2 isn't your traditional arena fighter. In fact, it's one of the most unique games ever made. Arc System Works took inspiration not just from 2D fighting games, but real-time strategy games and MOBAs, with paths, minions, summoned units, items, and of course, its combat system inspired primarily by arena fighters. Guilty Gear 2 was the first of its kind, not just in its combination of genre, but how its developers used their expertise in fighting games to craft, at the time, the most unique kits an arena fighter had ever seen, keeping the time-tested directional-based combat, but adding strings, cancels, meter-based abilities, and plenty of unique options. No character played anything alike, but this would only be the start of arena fighters testing the limits.
Yeah! Tricked out in this land of decay. Total madness. The world is over, and I love it.
Max Anarchy, or Anarchy Reigns as it is known in the West, was a try at the genre from the lens of an action game developer, Platinum Games. Instead of fighting in an arena, games usually took place in a large stage, and the focus was on the crazy environmental changes that would happen during the gameplay. Anarchy's combat system was a combination of action game fundamentals with the addition of meter that would control your powerful offensive options, being one of the first games to try cinematic attacks in a large multiplayer environment. Add the now iconic banger of a soundtrack, and you have one of the most energetic games Platinum has ever put out. Alas, Anarchy was held back by its poor marketing due to Sega, but this didn't stop it from being a cult hit, and certainly doesn't take away from its style.
You better recognize.
But a much larger IP would enter the arena fighter space next. Pokk was a dream come true for many. The fighting game experts at Bandai Namco and the absolute giant that is Pokemon would mesh together to create a game that would switch between arena fighter and 2D fighting game perspectives throughout the match. The field phase, which played more like a traditional arena fighter, focused on the mid and long range battle for positioning, and the duel phase, which played more like a traditional fighting game for the up-close battles, bridging the gap between the genres. Combine this with Pokken's assists and meter management systems, and Pokken could easily be seen as one of the more complex arena fighters. While Gundam Extreme Versus was the first successful arena fighter with a large competitive scene, it was almost entirely in Japan. Pokken would bring that scale and competition to the world, but it wouldn't be long until the Western market created their own competitive games in the genre. Towards the back half of the 2010s, we would get some of the most innovative and creative arena fighters ever made. For Honor was one of the first of these. For Honor added directional-based combat, no longer just the directional attacks you might know of, but literally attacking from 3 different directions that need to be blocked by the opponent in those specific directions. It also had virtually no combos, instead relying almost entirely on neutral, which is a breath of fresh air and a genre absolutely filled to the brim with minute-long combos and infinites. Sprinkle in some character diversity, and you have a surprisingly good reaction-based combat system. While games before it really put into question what people considered an arena fighter, the main motive for Honor wasn't even a direct duel against opponents, instead being more objective focused, which led to some people calling the game an action or third-person fighter. We'll put a pin in that because it will be relevant down the line, and even more relevant with the release of Absolver. Absolver took the directional-based combat, but it threw away conventional characters, instead allowing you to create your own and pick not only your defensive options, but your entire moveset, allowing expression and freedom in a way not seen in any arena fighter to date. At its best, fights could look like martial arts dances. But what was surprising is that Absolver was part RPG. Its customization wasn't just your moveset, but also your stats and gear. It was like taking everything good about MMO customization and putting it into an arena fighter. And this wouldn't be the last time arena fighters would borrow from other genres. Just like For Honor, Shinobi Striker might be closer to another genre. Team-based gameplay with roles similar to MMOs or hero shooters, and cooldowns for abilities reveal Shinobi's genre inspirations. Team Arena Fighters weren't actually all that new, but Shinobi would bring something unique. Unparalleled aerial combat combined with environmental interaction lent Shinobi a unique feel unlike any of its contemporaries. One of the major problems of Team Arena Fighters was the mess of multiple players all in the same area hitting each other. At this point, the only solution was the limitation of the combat system, making a lot of Team Arena Fighters very slow or committal, but Shinobi fixed this by letting you fight anywhere on the stage and giving you strong defensive options to deal with your opponents. Higher skilled players were rewarded by utilizing the environment to the fullest. It sacrificed individual character complexity for team play that had never been seen in an arena fighter. But as unique as Shinobi was, it lacked character depth, something that had plagued arena fighters up until this point. But not long after Shinobi, we would have a game to show that arena fighters could have characters just as diverse as their traditional counterparts. Kill la Kill If blows pretty much every arena fighter out of the water in terms of character diversity. Each one plays completely differently, with tons of combo creativity and simple but in-depth character archetypes. It is a simple combat system where every character has similar buttons like guard breaks or ranged attacks, but each one is used in wildly different ways from the next. This extends to the whole combat system, including character movement speed, where usually arena fighters have everyone move at the same speed. Big characters actually feel like lumbering giants, and small characters feel appropriately fast. Having characters who are faster or slower changes entire matchups and strategies, and it did all this without an assist system, something arena fighters had been relying on to provide depth to their games. Even arena fighters that had really original archetypes failed to balance them appropriately, where Kill la Kill If was surprisingly balanced for what it was. It's not perfect though, it has some very profound problems, but that does not take away that Kill la Kill If proved you could have a deep and diverse cast and a genre rife with games full of cloned characters. Considering how vast and varied the genre seems to be, we come back to the same question. What is an arena fighter? And an ironic twist, the first thing Virtual On was called back in EGM magazine was an action fighter. The term arena fighter wouldn't come around until way later. Games like Power Stone or Bushido Blade were still called 3D fighters, brawlers, or just action games. And a lot of Japanese arena fighter devs still call them some form of multiplayer action game rather than a fighting game. But this doesn't mean they aren't arena fighters. Ultimately, the community dubs the genre of these games and not the developers, for better or worse. Character action games or boomer shooters are great examples of communities taking it upon themselves to name a genre, which is why most of these games are called fighters despite not being originally called that, and a lot of people not even considering the third-person arena fighters to be arena fighters at all. One of the reasons I made this video is to show how these games all connect. Whether it be through directional-based attacks, lock-on, the boost gig, or any number of things arena fighters all borrow from each other over time. They have a recognizable identity, even from each other. There's a distinct difference between a Gundam Versus style game and an anime arena fighter, or the major differences between Power Stone and a Godzilla game. They could all be their own genre, each having evolved in their own way, and will continue to evolve as we move into the next era of arena fighters. Unfortunately, I had to leave out a lot of games, even some important ones. If you think I missed something or glossed over a game you're passionate about, let me know. Conversation about this genre is very important to me. I'm definitely not the be-all end-all, but I couldn't find history on arena fighters anywhere on the internet, so hopefully this is good enough for now. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.